Coming, very much. We have had a couple of cancellations, schedule conflicts, a couple of people had car trouble, they're on their way, some other people are on their way, so we might have some people trickling in. However, we're going to get started. There's a lot of information to go through, but considering the political situation in the world today, not just ISIS, of course, but figuring out how ISIS came to be and what is this struggle that's going on. We know there is a struggle. I think intuitively all human beings know that. But how do we figure it out? How do we know what's actually happening? And it's hard for us in North America to put it in its proper perspective. So I just want to test, everyone can hear me? We're okay? All right. I don't want to put this too close. There is music, just FYI, there is music going on in the back. I don't think we can actually hear it, so it should be okay. We may have a couple interruptions, but nothing too major. So, I'll start with a brief history of the Dialogue of Civilisations. This has been contributed significantly by both Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Lyndon Root. The 40-year history is at the table there if you did want to have a deeper understanding. The World Public Forum is where the Dialogue of Civilisations actually takes place. The gentleman on the left here is Yakunin. He was the head of Russian Railways for several years. I think it was over a decade. And he has been one of the principal promoters of the Silk Road policy and the development of Russia. And the other gentleman is Jagdish, on the top right there. Jagdish Kapoor. I don't know a lot in depth about who he is and what his history is, but I'll just give you a quote. He started off one of the dialogues with the following quote. He said, "The 21st century world inherited a civilization built on blood, tears, and hunger. At its portals stood two gatekeepers, destiny and death." So, as a person from India, he really understands the struggle going on today. And the third person is a Greek businessman, and his name is Nicholas. I don't have his last name here. But these gentlemen have been heading up this Dialogue of Civilisations, which has been contributed to by not only Helga and Lyndon, but also leaders from around the world. Just a couple examples are the Khomeini from Iran, Mubarak from Egypt, and I believe the head of, the leader of Armenia as well. So the Dialogue of Civilisations is the answer to the clash of civilizations. The World Public Forum was founded in Rhodes in 2003, and it was an explicit counterpole to Samuel Huntington's notorious thesis about the clash of civilizations. The forum has since then grown rapidly in size and influence in reaction to the insane push by the Bush administration and its backers, which today is continuing by Obama, and if Hillary Clinton gets in, will be continued by Hillary Clinton, and likely Donald Trump as well. It's a very large and high-level Russian delegation and major Russian sponsorship. The event reflected, albeit unofficially, a foreign policy orientation of Russia's government, as well as the thinking in India and a number of other views. The conception of the forum was approved by President Putin and officially supported by the heads of state of India, Iran, Uzbekistan, Greece, and other nations. So that gives you a bit of a history. So I'm continuing, by doing this event, we are continuing this dialogue. And this dialogue is not available to just leaders, and it is really here to inspire all of us to participate in this dialogue. I think, especially at this time in history, it's required. So I'm going to start off with my thesis. This is my thesis for my presentation. The oligarchical principle. If you've never heard of that, have a look at that word. The oligarchical principle necessitates the destruction of culture to deprive humanity of their potential, to realize our evolutionary potential to higher states of being. These higher states which today can be realized without war and conquest, but to be realized through cooperation, creativity, and scientific discovery. Altering and destroying history is the modus operandi of the networks that serve empire, not the common good. So today's dialogue is the continuation of many other leaders' efforts around the world to bring the ideas and contributions of their own society's history and of thought. So it's a society's history of thought to bear upon world events today. And this has been going on. This has been an ongoing dialogue, which really can be traced to a gentleman from the Islamic Renaissance named Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina was the Leonardo da Vinci of the Islamic world. And later, when we look closer at who Ibn Sina was and his multitude of contributions to humanity, you will see that within his works, you'll get to understand who he is from his works and his multiple writings, and that he can contribute to the solutions that we need today as well.
I know, but she doesn't understand that. You can't see that through that.
So this person is Friedrich Schiller, and he is the inspiration for the Schiller Institute, which we are a part of. Helga Zeppelin-Bruch, and he deserves his own presentation. I won't get into him, but this is a very prescient quote, and I think it's necessary. And I know it has served me well in dialogue with other people that we've been organizing and discussing. And so often the conversation just gets splintered into race and gender and different things that divide us. But he says something really great. Even that we found ourselves together here at this moment, found ourselves together with this degree of national culture, with this language, these manners, these civil benefits, this degree of freedom of conscience, is the result perhaps of all previous events in world history. The entirety of world history, at least, were necessary to explain this single moment. This moment as well. And what he was talking about when he said this was, he was speaking at a universal history class. He was a professor at a university in Germany. So this beautiful quote serves to set the tone, and with which I'll be presenting the information to you today. Universal history and culture are two ideas that cannot be unbroken, and must be if we are to have an honest discussion of the challenges and issues of peace today. We are all here, if we so choose, to move forward from the boundary conditions set by the modern interpretations of religion, cultural rights, and practices, as well as false scarcity imposed on us through the monetarist system pervasive in every area of our lives. This is not to diminish or render insignificant each culture or change them to suit one paradigm. However, it is to bring to light what each culture has to offer each other, to change them profoundly from one of exclusion to a culture we can call humanity, a truly humanist movement towards discovering the very essence of what makes us human, the human mind and how it works. This is Senator Richard Black, and he has been a contact of the LaRouche movement for several years. He's been pushing hard in Washington. He's a state senator, so he's not one of the higher ranking officials in the United States, but he has gotten a lot of attention because of his praise of Assad in Syria, as well as his calling out of the neocon establishment in the United States for what they have done to Syria, to Iraq, etc., and Libya as well. And this is, I have a video actually, but I think this is good enough. What you see in Kilmarea is the legacy of all civilization. It doesn't just represent Syria, it represents all of us. It is the legacy of all mankind, and what is happening in Syria will determine the fate of civilization. That's a pretty broad statement, but I'll explain it to you, and I think once you've heard the presentation, you understand better what it is he means. This is Khalil al-Assad. This is an archaeologist that was beheaded by ISIS. Palmyra was his home. There's a town outside of Palmyra as well, where people live, modern day culture, and it's very, very close to the ancient city of Palmyra. He was born there, and he spent his entire life there. He left only to study in the Syrian capital, Damascus, where he received degrees in history and education. According to, he was appointed the director of antiquities for Palmyra in 1963. He was the director of the museum, and he held these positions until he retired in 2003. He passed his positions on to his son, William, so he managed it like a business, a family business. A relative of Assad said that the scholar's deep connections with every artifact and every stone in Palmyra meant he would not abandon his home. Assad refused to leave the city, although he was aware of the danger he was facing. Hariri said they brought him to the square in a black van, then used loudspeakers to call for people to come and watch the execution. This, of course, is the famous Roman amphitheater where they beheaded, I believe it was about 20 individuals. More than 150 people, including women and children, watched as ISIS militants read out their decision to execute Assad. And according to Ted Murray, before a masked militant beheaded the scholar with a sword. His body was left on the ground for more than 6 hours, from 11 a.m. until 5 o'clock. After that, they strung his body up on a pole. If you understand what it took for him, what was his motivation, what was his passion that he did that. Before the arrival of ISIS, about 70–80% of the most important archaeological fragments were removed from the Museum of Palmyra. Only the large statues that could not be removed were left. Therefore, the ISIS militants mutilated the faces of the statues and smashed their heads. Experts from research laboratories are now engaged in collecting these fragments as well as in their cleansing and identification. He was threatened several times to reveal the location of the items that they actually took out. And that is why they beheaded him. Why would they do that? This is the question. And the dialogue of civilizations, a renaissance is really represented by the Platonic viewpoint. So now I'll get into a bit of the history. So bear with me, there's probably a lot of names you don't know, there's some names you do know. Overall, I mean, it's not to memorize this information, it's just to get a feel for it. So what does Palmyra represent? It's between the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's close to the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it is the crossroads of the caravan trade. Palmyra is in modern Syria, is in the middle of the desolate Tatamarian desert. All around are natural barriers, dry and bare mountains to the north, west, and the southwest, while to the east and the south are dry flatlands, with the volcanic basalt desert of the Haran merging into Jordan, and to the southeast in Iraq, and then Saudi Arabia. To the east, beyond the desert with its wadi and passes, runs the Euphrates River. But rather than being a barrier, it permitted traffic by river to come in through the Persian Gulf, from northwest India and beyond. The Tadmorian mountain range meant that roads went either north or south. The southern one came through Palmyra, which then became the hub of a series of roads. Thus, geographically, Palmyra was well served to become an important center of trade if the decision were made to cross this desert rather than take the long route around it. And that's how Palmyra came to be. In Palmyra, the inscriptions are in Aramaic and Greek. Of course, later on, much later on, Latin also survived, but only from the later years of the history of the city. In the Roman time, there was a standoff between Rome and Parthia. Palmyra in effect came to occupy a no man's land crisscrossed with caravan routes. Palmyra profited from its location, for there was a demand from Rome for the luxuries of the East, silks and spices. And Parthia, with its growing interest in Hellenistic culture, wanted the goods of the West. So there was this dynamic going on. They had the Chinese culture, Indian culture coming through there, but they also had the West. And when you look, I don't have a bigger picture right now, but if you look, I mean, really the Tigris and the Euphrates is the bridge between the Mediterranean and Europe on one side and India and China on the other. So it actually became a semi-independent town and was the middleman in this trade routes. So to understand Palmyra, I'm going to take you to two places which build up the idea that I really want to get across about the Islamic Renaissance, and to understand why they are actually going after, it's not just Palmyra. Palmyra is only a recent example. They have destroyed ancient artifacts in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in all over Syria. And you have to ask yourself if this band of thieves and killers, if they're just driven by chaos, why would they be going after these things? You have to ask yourself that question. And it's not just for money, although that is one of the things. And then that gets into a whole other conversation about who's buying these. So to give you a sense of the culture of Baghdad and Andalusia, will help give you the groundwork of what these areas actually represent along the Silk Road. In Baghdad, no other country and in no other cultural epoch was the drive so extensive for scientific travel so widespread as in Muslim Spain. From the 10th century on, it was perfectly commonplace for inhabitants of the peninsula to make their way across the monstrous stretch of the North African coast to Egypt, and from there to Bukhara and Samarkand, and in order to hear the lectures of a famous scholar. Knowledge was their drive. Almost everyone could read and write, whereas this was a privilege restricted to the clergy in Northern Europe. Under Caliph al-Mamun in Baghdad, translation work was transformed into a highly organized activity in a place called the House of Wisdom. And this is a complex which became a translation center, an academy, an astronomical observatory, and one of the richest libraries in the world. Directing a team of 90 translators was the Nestorian Christian in Muslim Baghdad, a man named Ibn Ishaq, and he introduced the method of conceptual rather than literal translation. And this is very important. All the works of classical Greece which could be found were rendered in Arabic, from the medical works of Hippocrates and Galen, to the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, to the science and geometry of Ptolemy, Euclid, and Archimedes. An effort of the same magnitude was undertaken in Muslim Spain as well, where institutions modeled on the House of Wisdom grew up in Cordoba and Seville. And I'll get into that a little bit later. Ibn Ishaq would give for each book to be translated its weight in gold. So it was their mission to go out and seek out texts, ancient Greek, Chinese, from Saudi Arabia, all over, wherever they could get their hands on texts, they would bring them to this guy, this Ishaq, and he would actually weigh them and then give them an equal value in gold. So, 10th century scholar Ibn Rabihi wrote that knowledge and its spread through education are the pillars on which rests the axis of religion and the world. They distinguish man from the beast and the rational from the irrational being. They promulgated a deep love and appreciation for new knowledge, as Muhammad himself explained. And this period of time that I'm referring to right now is in Baghdad, shortly after it was founded, and this was called the Abbasid Caliphate. And this is a map of what the Abbasid Caliphate actually looked like. So this culture that I'm describing to you in Baghdad, how did that actually start? Well, this is a map of the original city of Baghdad. And it was a planned city. It was a project of Al-Mansur. They wanted to move away from Kufa, I believe it was north, where they had, Baghdad had more resources. The choice of the location of Baghdad was that it was the spot where the Tigris and Euphrates were actually the closest. And before Baghdad was built there, in 756, there were some Christian monks who had been living in their village for decades, I think, already, if not more, 100 years. And so Al-Mansur went down and he talked to them, and trying to check out the area, and is this an okay place to live, and would you mind if we built a city here? And they actually did. They agreed. They were okay with that. And then the monks eventually became neighbors of the city of Baghdad. But Baghdad, interesting to note, at its height, it had more than 1 million people living in it. So this was the center of it. This was what it looked like initially, and then it just continued to grow out from there. It was originally built as a fortress, but it was a well-organized city. Christians and Jews and Muslims lived together relatively peacefully, but it was not, of course, without political and military bloodshed. So again, I want to make that point very clear. And this presentation, by the way, was I was given some assistance by a gentleman named Hussein Askari, and he is our Executive Intelligence Review correspondent and expert on the Middle East. Hussein Askari is from Iraq originally. He now lives in Sweden and heads up our organization there, but he is a highly recognized expert on the Middle East, the history of it. He's written many articles. I do have a couple over here as well. So one thing that I do want to preface, even though I'd like to focus, of course, on the more positive things that happened out of this Renaissance, is not to sound dogmatic. There was bloodshed. There was military interventions. But those things were of a political nature. And it's not, this discussion today and what I'm presenting to you is not to get into what happened there. It's to really show you what the culture was like and how those ideas spread. I'm sure we can get into that, and again, it would take another whole presentation on the politics of it. But when Mansur set out to build the city, he employed over 100,000 people, and these were architects, craftsmen, merchants, and construction workers. 100,000 people he gathered together. So you can imagine that there were a lot of cities actually in the area already. And there were. As a matter of fact, in archaeology right now, they are uncovering ancient civilizations beyond Sumer. There is a city in Oman called Ubar. There's another one in the Balkans. I cannot remember the name, but it is hundreds of... Sorry? Banya. I believe that's it, yeah. And so just to put this in perspective, I mean, there was a great culture there well ahead of time. So Baghdad was not building something new, they were just building it better. So Al-Mansur is noted as saying by the chronicler Al-Tabari, he said, "This is a good location. Here is the Tigris, nothing stands between us and China. Everything comes to us through it from the sea. Goods reach us here from Al Jazeera." And Al Jazeera is not just a TV station, it is actually a region in Anatolia, which is now modern-day Turkey, and Armenia as well. So he says, there's the Euphrates. Through it we receive goods from Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean and its surroundings. Initially, and this is end of quote, initially the Chinese and the Caliphate did clash, politically and militarily. However, it didn't last long, and soon after, the Chinese and the Baghdad Caliphate became military allies against the Byzantines and the Mongols. It's very important to note. And it was in this context and geographical position between China and the Mediterranean that the leaders of the Islamic State in the time, at the time were thinking, not as an empire. Diplomatic relations with China were established in 650 originally. And Prophet Muhammad's companion, Sa'id ibn Waqqas, had visited the Chinese Tang Dynasty emperor. And at the time, later on, Emperor Yang Wei, according to the writer Yusuf Abdul Rahman, quote, he respected the teachings of Islam and considered it to be compatible with the teachings of Confucius. And to show his admiration of Islam, the emperor approved the establishment of China's first mosque, which is still standing today, and this is a picture of it. It's called Kuisheng Mosque, and it's in Guangzhou province. Very interesting. This is a picture of the very first hospital in Baghdad. Baghdad was actually the center of medical learning, of understanding. And here's a picture of the House of Wisdom. And it was Mansur who set up the House of Wisdom. And this was a humanist academy, in the Platonic tradition. Prophet Muhammad's commandment to Muslims, and this is a quote from Hussein Askari. He says, in brackets, he says, the same as the one he received from God, Allah, through divine inspiration, from the outset of his mission was to encourage Muslims to learn reading and writing, and to acquire knowledge no matter how far they had to travel and how hard they had to work. It is recorded in one of the hadiths in their verbal traditions, and it's used quite frequently in the Muslim world, is pursue knowledge even if it were in China. So one of the great inventions of this age, which we can still feel the effects of today, is the invention of paper. Seems simple. But the Arab world, through their eventual positive relations with China, incorporated this amazing invention. Imagine what our world would have developed without paper. As a matter of fact, the Islamic Renaissance wouldn't have happened had they not had this technology sharing with China. If it weren't for the introduction of paper, the Islamic Renaissance would not have been as far spread and successful as it was. And another historical example of the benefits of mutual cooperation. So Mansur promoted this translation movement. Now, the translation movement, it needs to be highlighted here and really brought into prominence for several reasons. It's not, the translation movement is often, I know in school I was just given the impression that the European Renaissance got all their information about the Greeks from India and from the Arabs. Well, it is much, much more than that. Because of the emphasis and the sincere passion to acquire knowledge from the commandment of Muhammad, the Caliphate placed such importance on the gathering of texts from around the world that they paid for their weight in gold, as I already said. In order to find manuscripts of the works of Plato and other Greek philosophers, which were available in the neighboring and often hostile Byzantine Empire, where modern-day Turkey is, Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun used both diplomacy and sometimes military means to get it. In one of his battles with the Byzantines, al-Rashid suggested exchanging Roman prisoners and officers for Greek textbooks. The most effective method that al-Mamun used were intelligence agents to hunt for books and recruit Greek-speaking translators from the Byzantine Empire. So Muslim historian al-Nadim wrote, when al-Mamun defeated the Roman king, he wrote to him demanding that he disclose, that he disclose all the books that he had been keeping in secret places in Rome, at the time Constantinople. The Roman king first refused, but later agreed. Al-Mamun sent some of his scholars from the House of Wisdom to retrieve them, and were ordered to translate them immediately, and appointed a guardian to protect the original books. The translation proceeded immediately, on his orders. Other stories from chroniclers and historians note that the Byzantine collection of Greek works were kept in a special chamber where nobody could have access to them. It is indeed obvious from these stories that the Greek philosophical texts the Byzantines were hoarding were intentionally kept away from the public in the Eastern Roman Empire for clear political and ideological reasons. Educating the public and allowing foreign powers to acquire knowledge is always deemed as a threat by anti-human imperial powers. The translation movement was not just a literal translation of texts from Greek to Arabic. In fact, it's important to note that many languages were being spoken in this part of the world and studied. However, the Arabic language's development was the codification of the mission to produce a unifying language in the Arab world. And they discovered, because Al-Mamun had given them not only the mission to translate the work, but then he actually told his scientists and translators and scholars, he said, okay, so now that you've discovered these wonderful ideas from the Greek world, I want you to test them out. So they had discovered Eratosthenes' measurement of the circumference of the Earth. So these weren't just translators, these were also now scientists and quasi-physicists as well. And they were given the direction to test these out. So a couple of scholars from the House of Wisdom named the Vanuatu brothers actually not only did they prove Eratosthenes' calculation, but then they actually recalculated it using their own method. So this is how these ideas really, were brought forward from the ancient past and then perfected as well. And their measurements today, it's concluded that they were, I think they were only a couple hundred kilometers off, which is amazing. So the astronomical observatories, one of the richest libraries in the world, the Arab culture was greatly affected by the translation movement through the language. Because of the Muslim religion, it is incumbent on them to read and recite the Quran in Arabic in daily prayers. Believers who were won over to the faith had had to learn to speak, read, and write the language of the Quran. Its expansion was tantamount to a literacy campaign. Keep in mind that before an organized society was made possible, the Muslim leaders had to organize tribes. It was largely just tribal organization, and they had been largely illiterate. So the cities that sprung up, Baghdad being one of the first, made it possible for learning on a large scale. And the same thing happened in Muslim Spain. Now, this part is important. The systematic treatment of word formation was crucial to the monumental translation efforts begun in Baghdad. The ideas that they were translating from Greek expressed about philosophy and science, new Arabic terms had to be coined. So through the process of this translation work, they actually codified the Arabic language as well, and they created new words that were, to express it. So you can see how the literal translation literally does not convey the idea. It can't possibly. And learning languages, just an FYI, is not a process of just reciting words of another language. I myself only learned English growing up. And I often heard my parents speaking Low German, which is a verbal-only language. It's not actually written. And much to my dismay, they did not teach me this language because they wanted to have some private conversations. So I only learned English growing up. But now I am embarking on learning Russian, and this is still ongoing. I think I can only say hi, how are you, and colors and whatnot. But so, just even though I'm learning it late in life, I've learned, even from the minimal that I've learned from Russian so far, is that there are words in the Russian language that actually, one word represents a whole concept, where we don't have any English words. And I know this to be true in other languages as well. So we are deprived, really, in our culture of these multiple languages, because a lot of the people and the scholars in this ancient world spoke multiple languages, not just one or two. So, in any case, Dante Alighieri, in the European Renaissance, he would later call Arabic an illustrious vernacular, a language spoken by the people, but forged through the transmission of universal ideas. In this case, divine revelation into a vehicle capable of transmitting the most profound ideas regarding man and the universe. The idea inspired by the Islamic Renaissance would be developed later in the European Renaissance through the concept of metaphor, which is mostly thoroughly expressed through the science of poetry, classical art, and classical music. And as LaRouche and others in the modern era have conceived, these areas of human meditation are not just cultural expressions, but are actually the basis of scientific thought. Now, skipping ahead about Baghdad just quickly, it's important for people to understand that until the 1940s, Baghdad was still a center of learning. It went through a very dark period, but until the 40s, it was where most people sent their children to go to university. They had still a very organized instruction society. And Christians and Jews have lived there for thousands of years, and they still do. And of course, this is what Baghdad looks like today. And something interesting that I found out this morning was that, yes, they have electricity, and it's been destroyed. Something interesting that I found out this morning was that after the Iraq invasion, Paul Bremer, who is installed as one of their interim government representatives, instituted a law that could not be repealed by any further government, any future government. A foreigner from another country, the US, instituted a law that no future government could repeal. Can you imagine? Now, this is what the law was. It was for their agriculture and against their farmers. This is a Monsanto bill. Farmers there were no longer allowed to share seeds or to use their own seeds for planting. It is really sick what we have done to this country. And by we, I mean them. You know what I mean. Okay. So I won't be talking about Baghdad again, so I wanted to leave that there. But so the other major center of the Islamic Renaissance was Andalusia. And Andalusia is on the tip of Spain. They were directly influenced by the developments in Baghdad, and it was also a thriving center of learning and cultural cooperation. If you understand anything about these kinds of processes, you start a project one place, and the next place that takes it on is likely going to find improvements and better ways of doing it, and then of course it reflects the culture there as well. And so Moorish Spain actually erupted, and it lasted longer than Baghdad. Moorish Spain most affected the European Renaissance through the translation movement of ancient Greek texts, which were transmitted to Europe through Spain. The 9th to the 13th century, Andalusia was a beacon of learning. And this is a mosque. The mosques actually, because of the Muslim religion, and because everybody needed to learn and understand Arabic in order to recite the Quran, and because, of course, now we find out that they were learning a whole bunch of other things in science and philosophy and whatnot, the mosques actually became universities and schools. So, but to understand where's the tie-in with trade and development? Trade and development and cooperation among cultures go hand in hand. And this is where we have been really inundated today with economic policy. We think we have trade. We think we have this globalization of free trade. Today's very different. Today's trade is a very different version of what they had in those days. Free trade is a British idea, and it's not free at all. And today it is under the control of the City of London, and it's incorporated by the likes of an oligarchical perversion of what a true Renaissanceian trade could really be like. And this is what we are, why we're promoting the Silk Road as a true trade policy. Andalusia could not have thrived as long as it did without Baghdad's existence. Because of the ties between Baghdad, China, and the Mediterranean, Europe's culture benefited greatly, not just because they received tea and spices from the Orient, but because of the trade of ideas brought through ancient texts translated through the House of Wisdom. Education in Islam was one for the common person. Unlike under Roman rule and the Byzantines after them, Andalusian rulers promoted learning and patronized the arts as a means of raising the cultural level of the whole population. The great mosque seen here was built in 785 on top of a small Catholic church, which Al-Rahman had demolished, unfortunately, but this was established as the religious and educational center of the capital. It's still standing there today. Many other mosques were built in Muslim Spain. And the first universities and the first libraries, public libraries, and the first public education system and schools were in Moorish Spain. And then they went to Europe. This is where they actually started, because of the inspiration of Baghdad. The universities in Europe, like I said, came afterwards. It actually gave rise to public schools for needy children as well. 70 of those schools that were built in Andalusia were actually still open in the 13th century. Such high literacy rates were achieved that almost everyone could read and write, whereas this was a privilege restricted to the clergy in Northern Europe, as I said. An interesting thing to note as well is that, now this is getting into some detail of the politics. Before the Abbasid Caliphate, there was the Umayyad dynasty, or Umayyad Caliphate as well. They were both Muslim, but they had some different ideas about how to do it. So Andalusia originally was an Umayyad, it was started by someone from the Umayyad Caliphate who was running away from Baghdad. But Mansur, I believe it was Mansur in Baghdad, he had already established diplomatic ties with Charlemagne from France. And this is a picture of a painting of Al-Rashid, receiving the delegation of the leader of the Franks, Charlemagne. There's another picture, I don't have it here, but they're actually, someone painted a picture of them playing polo together. So you can imagine what kind of, like today we have a diplomatic meeting amongst leaders. They all get their 100 employees or however many they need. They jump on a plane and they meet each other. Can you imagine what a diplomatic meeting of two leaders of these nations would have been like in that day? How long they had to travel, how long it took there to actually get there. So this is a commitment. This is a real big commitment on their part. And they also had to trust these people. They had to trust that they wouldn't have some sort of military ambush waiting for them. So there were a lot of protocols that they had to use to build this kind of trust. So when the former Umayyad leader went to Andalusia, Spain, Mansur asked Charlemagne if he would stand and oversee this new dynasty culture, civilization growing in Andalusia, Spain. And so it's interesting. Now, it wasn't Charlemagne there imposing his will. He was there to help, to make sure, because the Abbasid Caliphate knew the history of the bloodshed, and that he was trying to actually prevent that from happening. So anyways, Al-Rashid was a successor of Mansur from Baghdad. He established strong diplomatic relations with Charlemagne and attempted to establish, Charlemagne, in turn, because of his interaction with Baghdad and in Andalusia, tried to establish a Renaissance in Europe as well. his efforts were not only inspired by the Arab world, but by the Irish Celts as well. Those in Celtic Ireland who were not subjected to Roman domination had developed a Platonic culture and had a long history of it as well. They supplied Charlemagne's court with some of its greatest intellectuals. The Celts were a repository of Neoplatonic thought. Diplomatic and trade ties established between Islam and the Celts account for the striking similarities between the Arabic calligraphic art and the Celtic Renaissance masterworks epitomized by the Book of Celts. So just an interesting tidbit there. Okay, so we're going along swimmingly here. So actually, I'll end off there. I know I already touched on this, but this is the result of British intelligence manipulation. That's what this is. The Iraq War was built on a complete lie. It was, that lie came from Tony Blair and the absurd U.S. imperialist ambitions of Dick Cheney and the Bush apparatus. And so again, they're not just destroying a city, they're not just killing millions of people. And they estimate that the number now is upwards of 1.5 million. They're destroying culture. And it's our culture. This is not just Baghdad's culture, as Senator Black said about Syria. Palmyra is not just about Syria. This is about all of us. Ironically, Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate was initially destroyed by the Mongols. And unfortunately, they were having some internal problems, but those internal problems at the time were being exploited by the Mongols. So this is an interesting tie here, because not very many people know this, but the Mongols were deployed to destroy Baghdad by the Venetians. The Venetian Empire actually is, not very many people know a lot about it. It's not put in the history books. They maintained their space on in Italy. It was a very, very controlled society. And that is actually where the modern day city of London bases their model on. The monarchy of the world all generate their ideas from the Venetian Empire. And so the Mongols were deployed to invade Baghdad in 1215, and that was the end of Baghdad, the Islamic Renaissance in Baghdad.
Walking in a city of 1 million people at the time.
Yeah, yeah. Baghdad was a thriving, huge city. So, just like in the time of the Venetians destroying this Renaissance, were they just going after resources? No. That is a very good reason, but it's not the ultimate reason. So this is where we come into the idea of the clash of civilization. And I'm going to tell you a bit about these gentlemen. The ideology of the clash of civilizations came from two gentlemen named Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis. Now these are the intelligentsia of the elite, two of many, but these two in particular. Now they wrote several books, Clash of Civilizations. They really outlined this idea, but the idea was presented to everyone that this is just how it's going to go. That this is their prediction about world civilizations and what's going to happen to them if they come together. That it's just eventually going to crumble. And so this idea, while it's presented as something, somewhat of a scholastic prediction, it's nothing of the sort. This was the plan. This was planned. And these guys laid down the framework for it. Now, what else is interesting, which you don't know probably a lot about, is that Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis were not just historians from England, or America for that matter. They were British intelligence agents. Why do historians work for British intelligence? You have to ask yourself that. So they just, basically their idea was that, it's men are beasts. They claim that China, the Islamic world, and the West will inevitably clash, and they cannot coexist as equals. They can't work together for economic, scientific, and cultural development, and it is debunked by these histories of the Renaissance, which I just described to you, Baghdad and Andalusia. There are many other examples of that, of which other dialogue discussions can be dedicated to. The reality of Muslim society between the 8th and the 13th century was not always rosy, certainly not. There were civil wars, there were bloody power struggles and intrigues. However, most of those in power and their scholars, advisors, scientists, and citizens realized and agreed that knowledge was power. Today, the Islamic world has been pulled down into a bloody political and religious struggle. Knowledge and the love of wisdom have taken a back seat. Many Muslim nations today are experiencing a state of cultural and economic stagnation, if not outright degeneration, because of these foreign policies. Now, what is common between the Western bestial ideologues and politicians such as Dick Cheney and Tony Blair with their counterparts in Saudi Arabia, ISIL, and Al-Qaeda is this process of dehumanization of individuals and groups. It is no coincidence that many of the top Iraqi military leaders of ISIL are former Iraqi soldiers and officers of the Republican Guard and Special Forces who, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, were imprisoned and tortured by US and British forces in the most unimaginable and humiliating way, in such infamous locations as Abu Ghraib and Camp Bucca. That is where the leader of ISIL, al-Baghdadi himself, was incarcerated by the US forces in Iraq in 2004. These prisons, like other CIA-run prisons around the globe, became the recruiting and brainwashing centers that produced a new generation of mass killers who, exactly like their prison guards and torturers, I'm sure we've all seen the pictures from Abu Ghraib, produced a new generation of, regarded anyone who was not on their side as less than human, and more like an animal or an insect who could be crushed, maimed, or burned in cold blood. Intolerance is the key aspect of this bestial mentality. This mentality does have precedence in the Islamic history, and I need to emphasize that. It's not that this just sprung up, but the elites of today, this Club of Rome, these ideologues, Bush and Cheney and Blair, they know how this works. They know better. They know how to create this kind of culture and chaos and bloodshed. So the alternative to that, of course, is the Renaissance. And I just want to finish that one last part. There's one person in particular from the Muslim world, Ibn Taymiyyah, who is the key source of the inspiration for the Saudi Wahhabi movement and its creations of Al-Qaeda and ISIL. So, like I say, there are people within the Muslim world, of course, and I'll actually get into that right now. But a nice quote from Hussein Askari, and of course as an Iraqi citizen who has seen his country destroyed, he's had family members killed, and he is actively pursuing a policy that is anathema to these individuals right here at the Club of Rome. This is a nice quote from him. He says, "The distance between the greatness of the Arab Islamic Renaissance of the 9th century and the current Dark Age is not only a distance of years, but of thought and appreciation of human life and potential." I'm not going to get into it in depth, but there is an article over here on the table as well. The British Svengali, the Bernard Lewis, and it goes into what he did. And just one brief thing is to understand that he knew what he was doing. After Osama bin Laden released 1998 Jihad on February 23rd, the very next day, Bernard Lewis wrote an open letter, which was printed in the New York Times, I believe, to President Clinton, and he was speaking on behalf of a group called the Committee for Peace and Security in the Gulf. The Committee for Peace and Security in the Gulf was demanding that the U.S. government throw its full support behind a military campaign to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Because, of course, we all know that Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. So it's interesting when you really put the pieces together and are given the actual information that you need to know. So these gentlemen, I can give you all their names, but it's not really important. These gentlemen were all at a conference in 1981, and this gets at the heart of the modern day. This is the modern exploitation of these aspects in the Islamic culture. Islam in the West was essentially the Club of Rome, and they were covertly, not so covertly, supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the organizing body behind ISIS today. Excuse me. So this conference, we sent an EIR journalist to this conference in 1981. In 1980, a few months before that, before this conference, our movement in Europe, the Schiller Institute, put on a conference in celebrating the 1000th anniversary of Ibn Sina. Helga was to give a presentation on Ibn Sina at this conference, and she received death threats. She was not allowed to talk about Ibn Sina. So she didn't attend, but the conference went ahead. So you'll understand why that's really important when I explain who these people are. So 1 week after the assassination of Anwar Sadat by the Muslim Brotherhood, this group meets, and they decided on some changes for Islamic teachings. They had members from Britain, France, and Italy associated with shadow government and intelligence circles. One Egyptian, Salam Assam, was in attendance. This person was a close friend of General al-Shazli, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry, who was responsible for planning the assassination of Anwar Sadat. So someone who was closely associated with the assassination of an Egyptian leader was at this conference a week later. With, by the way, former president of Syria was there in attendance, and he's actually in this picture here. Very different person from what we have today. And the a French diplomat at the end, and also the former French president was attending this conference as well. So what they put forward at this conference was a revision of Islamic traditional texts and historical textbooks, and also a science and technology project. So it is blasphemous to even say that the Quran, and there's many people who go about talking about the Bible, how it's pure, it is the divine word of God, and so this is a very contentious issue that the Quran has been changed. And I don't say that the Quran has been changed. They did not mention the Quran specifically, but they do mention Islamic textbooks and historical references. So also in attendance was this man. He's a part of the Club of Rome in Senegal, called the Club of Dakar. Unfortunately, he is a Sufi who's linked to this group, and he said, this is a quote from him, "Islamic texts should be purged of Western values and concepts, including Greek, and should return to the mystical teachings of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Allah." And I'll tell you who Al-Ghazali was. Now, when they say Western values and concepts, this is 1981, keep in mind, and they don't mean Western concepts as we have them today. They weren't exporting rap, you know. What they mean by Western is Greek. What they mean is the ideas of the European Renaissance, which all of us have been deprived of. And so he also said that this project is also to correct distorted teaching of history in countries like France and Germany. France and Germany, by the way, were two places where the people who were inspired by Ibn Sina after the Islamic Renaissance in Europe, where they had set up these universities to study specifically Ibn Sina. So he mentions France and Germany specifically here. And they have been subject at all times to the dangers of hegemonic interests. The teaching of history is often held up in schools as the guardian of a national tradition with cultural stereotypes and distorted prejudices. The revision of textbooks is the first thorough step toward listing the distorted ideas and the false stereotypes which influence public attitudes, and towards stopping them from being unconsciously or consciously handed down to future generations. Such a revision would include complete elimination of offensive views. And they really do know the difference between Aristotle and Plato, and what they try to get rid of is this Platonic influence. Interesting to note, as I already mentioned about the conference prior to this, that Helga had been threatened, and I'll get into her presentation afterwards. But first, this guy. So this is where the Aristotelian influence comes in. He promoted the literal interpretation of the Quran. There was not to be any improvements made to the Quran. There was not to be any concepts further extrapolated, any of this. And the Aristotelians of Europe heavily promoted. He was born in Persia in 1058 AD, and he was born shortly after Ibn Sina died. His father died when he was quite young, but the guardian saw to it that he was very well educated, and he did receive a good education. After he had spent some years of study in Baghdad, the Caliphate of Baghdad had appointed him a professor at a university in Baghdad. At the age of 33, he had attained one of the most distinguished positions in the academic world in his day. Now, Ghazali himself wrote that the source of Muslims' infidelity was their hearing terrible names such as Socrates and Hippocrates, Plato and Aristotle. And I should just point out that, yes, he is mentioning both, but the ideas of both Plato, the dichotomy between Plato and Aristotle, like I said, are very intertwined. It's hard to, and they didn't actually separate them out until later in the European Renaissance. But the basis of those ideas were, I think there was an instinctual drive towards one or the other. And Aristotle and Plato both have multiple works. One point I forgot to tell you about, and this is important, about Aristotle and Plato. People often think that Aristotle was a student of Plato. They were actually diametrically opposed, and people also think that Aristotle was the mentor of Alexander the Great. And actually, one of Alexander the Great's assassins was Aristotle's nephew. He didn't succeed, but another assassin which did succeed at killing Alexander the Great was also from Aristotle's networks. So if this tells you anything about the two. Anyways, I'm sorry, I'll get back to this. So the followers of the philosophers relate how, with all the gravity of their intellects and the exuberances of their erudition, they denied the sacred laws and creeds and rejected the details of the religions and faiths, believing them to be fabricated ordinances and bedizened trickeries. Now, after Ibn Sina died, Al-Ghazali led the witch hunt, and he banned his books. He had them burned. Cordova kept his teachings, Cordova in Andalusia, Spain, they kept his teachings alive through a gentleman named Ibn Rushd. He was a native of Cordova. Al-Ghazali wrote a book refuting Ibn Sina's work called The Destruction of Philosophy. And so Al-Ghazali is really the Bertrand Russell of his day, of Muslim scholarly work. And Bertrand Russell, we have some literature on him as well. Essentially what that means, what I mean when I say that, is that he used philosophy to destroy philosophy. So Al-Ghazali was no dummy. He's not promoting the literary translation of the Quran because he can't figure it out. or because he's ignorant. He was very well educated, but he saw that that was not the right way in his worldview to manage people. They should be taught the literal. And instead of figuring things out for themselves and using their own minds, they should rely strictly on the scripture in the context of the time. So Al-Ghazali is best known for his work on the destruction of philosophy. And Ibn Rushd, who is promoting it in Sina in Andalusia, wrote a book called The Destruction of the Destruction. And ironically, the matter was terminally concluded in the Islamic world with a ludicrous little treatise called The Destruction of the Destruction of the Destruction. And this was written by another guy named Zada, on orders from the Sultan Muhammad II, the conqueror, right after the capture of Constantinople. So after the Islamic Renaissance, Baghdad, what would really be the historical inheritors or predecessors of the Muslim Brotherhood philosophy, conquered Constantinople in 1453. So, an example of his penchant for the death penalty, as a consequence of these impieties, exuberances, and trickeries, Ghazali demanded the death penalty for anyone practicing philosophy, for anyone holding the opinions of the philosophers of the era preceding him, and even for anyone holding opinions derived from these philosophers. And as an example of his penchant for the death penalty, Ghazali demanded the execution of many who made a public declaration that the body did not share with the soul in immortality. This was an assertion of Ibn Sina. Now, of course, this sort of thing also happened in Western Christian society up until the 17th century and beyond. The point, though, is that no great Western philosopher, Ghazali is deemed to be the greatest Muslim philosopher. No great philosopher ever demanded the silencing of philosophy, let alone the death penalty for those philosophers who said the wrong thing. And I can go into his philosophy further. I think I'm going to skip a bit of this, but I just want to highlight one point. If we think that this manipulation of historical texts and different things is isolated to the Muslim world, you're greatly mistaken. And this was a big, this is a big thing for people to take in. I found a book in our Movement Seattle library, and it was from 1917. And it was written by an author who wrote for the Los Angeles Times. His pen name was S.S. Van Dyne, but he was a journalist, like a legitimate journalist for newspapers as well. He actually did his detective novels later on in his life. But he points this out about the encyclopedias that were being brought over from Britain. And if you all know, the word encyclopedia actually comes from British scholarly circles. And what we have today in academia is the direct result of the backlash of the Renaissance. This is not, we always have this concept that, the Renaissance was great and that, we still are living with this legacy and we have a free world. We get to choose between Coke or Pepsi because of these things and we have freedom. Well, this is not the case, unfortunately. And so I found it very interesting that, that this writer in particular, not only did he point this out, but he went through the encyclopedia meticulously and wrote a whole book. The book is not, I read the book and it's not actually, it's not a great read, like but it goes through every subject, philosophy, science, poetry, drama, all the different areas. And he points out who's missing. He says, where is this guy? Can't, his particular preferences are not the important thing here, but the fact that they're missing is important. And as far as tradition, and this is also another important thing to take into consideration about language, because we share the same language as Britain, and he points out, that we have we have a deficiency. If we don't learn other languages, we're not learning what these other people are saying in their own language, with their historical context, with what they're actually meaning. And if we're not taught the proper history, then we're also not understanding what was actually going on for them to write those things. So I just wanted to point that out. So now I'm going to get to the good guy, Ibn Sina. This is prior to this Al-Ghazali character. Ibn Sina's influence really spread, and this is what I was saying earlier, how it got up into Europe. But this is what the Ibn Sina's world looked like at the time. Ibn Sina was all these wonderful things. A polymath, by the way, is someone who is well versed in many different subjects and considered an expert in lots of different areas. So, Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, was born in 980 near Bukhara, in contemporary what's Uzbekistan today, and he died in Iran in 1037. He was a Persian polymath, foremost philosopher, physician of his time. He was also an astronomer, chemist, geologist, logician, paleontologist, mathematician, physicist, poet, psychologist, scientist, soldier, statesman, and teacher. Unfortunately, today, he is only associated in the Middle East with hospitals. You'll find lots of hospitals in the Middle East that are the Ibn Sina Hospital. Now, he did write seminal work on medicine. His canon of medicine was translated into Latin, and you can still find many references to that today. But there is much debate as to whether, as to which faction of Islam he actually was born into and was influenced by. But I don't want to focus on that. Looking at his biography is important, but and there does appear to be some Ismaili influence through his father. And there was a movement in Cairo. Cairo, the city, was actually founded by Ismailis, I believe. In the big picture of things, though, sorry, the modern day city of Cairo. In the big picture, though, it's really significant to look at what he was writing and the ideas that he was exploring to understand him best. And when you actually look at his life's work, you truly do understand that the influence on Ibn Sina was his own mind. And this is a very important point to get. He accomplished quite a bit, as you can see. And I just want to quickly point out a paradox. We used to have polymaths all the time. When you study ancient history or even Middle European history, Kepler, Leibniz, all of the, that's just two, but all of the great thinkers and anybody who is who's really promoted nowadays, up until the 18th century, they all had multiple areas of expertise. And so I know for myself, when I went to university, you're taking history of philosophy. Well, I learned about Aristotle or Plato. And when I took the history of math, I also learned about Aristotle and Plato. So, you know, this is an example of how Aristotle's compartmentalization of our education system has really turned things on its head. Everyone has the potential to be all of these things if given the right environment, and we are not given the right environment. A true Renaissance would produce more of these geniuses. Okay, sorry. So this is a Latin translation of Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine. A professor, Bouillet, who was studying the Islamic Renaissance and the European Renaissance, he said, quote, if it had not been for the Muslims, we might never have had a Renaissance at all. That's quite a powerful thing to say. Now, ironically, Sputnik News, about 2 weeks ago, posted a story about this work on the right of Ibn Sina's historical observation of a supernova. So his work is still being discovered. And this supernova was also recorded by people in Yemen and Saudi Arabia and somewhere else in Europe, I believe. But just so you know, and this is true of a lot of the great thinkers, their works have only been translated in the last, Kepler, Johannes Kepler, who discovered how the universe actually works, his work, The Harmonies, was only translated in the 1980s from Latin, which is pretty remarkable. So if you can read Latin, you're okay. How many of us know Latin? So this is the metaphysics of Avicenna. He was most profoundly influenced. He most profoundly influenced the European Renaissance figures Nicholas of Cusa, Roger Bacon, and Raymond Lull from Spain. And his work on the metaphysics is where he discusses the concept of the necessary existent. And this is the idea that Al-Ghazali attacked. It's also been turned into a theological argument. And what he actually was talking about, just like Nicholas of Cusa, who even though he was a cardinal in the Catholic Church, was a scientist. These men were scientists, clearly by all of the things that he accomplished. He wasn't just a theologian. As a matter of fact, I would say that was the minor of the two ideas, science and theology. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has studied Ibn Sina's works in detail. She's actually quite a Ibn Sina expert. So this is the idea that he was getting at in his, and he's really getting at the idea of what is thought, and how does our mind work. And I won't get into this in great detail, but there are direct correlations between what he was talking about, what Nicholas of Cusa after him was talking about, what many other humanist thinkers were discussing after his work was disseminated, is that there's the knower, the known, and knowledge, and the distinction between the three, but not just the separation of the three, and how they all intermingle, how they all come together. The picture on the left is a picture, an Arabic painting of Socrates and his students. This was discovered in a 13th century Syrian manuscript of Ibn Fatih's work. I can't say it in Arabic, I'm sorry, but it's kept at the Topkapi Palace in library in Istanbul. Ibn Sina's essential contribution to epistemology is that the human mind must first develop a consciousness of itself. A consciousness of itself. The act of knowledge involves three elements: the knower, the known, and knowledge. And when man examines himself as the object of knowledge, the knower, and the object of knowledge become one. Even though they're three ideas, I don't want to call them separate, but even though they're three ideas, it's the unifying of them when man examines himself. In that way, the individual human beings understand that I am knower and the known and knowledge. The individual's very identity becomes knowledge. And I can tell you, after studying a plethora of material for this, I can attest to this very much. It is this knowledge which makes man different from other species. And it is this sense of identity as knowledge which societies must be organized to fulfill in human beings. This is how society should be organized, so that people can realize this about themselves. Everybody has the potential. It doesn't matter what race or gender you come from. We all have this ability. And unfortunately, shortly after Ibn Sina's death, fortunately, his works were translated into Latin, and they were widely circulated throughout Europe, specifically. They were burned in Baghdad, but they were promoted in Europe. And another individual who was inspired by him was Pope Sylvester II, known as the Pope with the Arab spirit. Another gentleman was Roger Bacon, Nicholas of Cusa, as I said. Bacon promoted the study of Ibn Sina and founded an Abyssinian faction among scholars in Paris. He promulgated Abyssinian ideas throughout universities in France, England, and Italy. Now this is what the Ibn Sina expert Helga has to say about him, and also Nicholas of Cusa. Cusa's concept of the non-other, discovered Zep LaRouche, is identical to Ibn Sina's necessary existent. Following Ibn Sina, Cusa demonstrates that the laws governing the human mind are identical to the laws governing material processes in the universe. That's a big idea. The laws governing the human mind are identical to the laws governing material processes in the universe. I'm going to let that one resonate for a little bit. The invariant in the life of the universe is the succession of moments of transformation from one domain of lawfulness to higher laws. This principle is equivalent to the most advanced conception in modern science. And this is represented in Vladimir Vernadsky's work. And if you don't know who Vladimir Vernadsky is, I really suggest you have a look at some of our material. We do have a book of his over there, The Economics of the Noosphere. But one of the key concepts of Vernadsky, which is really very profound, is that scientific thought is a planetary phenomenon. And this is getting at the heart of what Ibn Sina is actually talking about. This is where science and spirituality can meet for people. This is scientific thought, which is inseparable from us as human beings in our discoveries, which then affects the planet. And contrary to the Green Movement, who the Club of Rome started, by the way, the Green Movement, we are part of nature. And nature is not static, nature is dynamic. We are growing with nature and we are all evolving. The planet is evolving and we are evolving. So the Cusan approach is totally different from the modern pantheistic or phenomenological forms of ecumenical dialogue. Because there is a lot of ecumenical dialogue going on around the world, but Helga's distinguishing this very clearly, in which the existence of the one knowable truth is denied in favor of a democratic plurality of religious opinions. And this is where, you know, you're going into the Aristotelian mess, which is where we have to tolerate the worst of every culture and then put them all in the same room and watch what happens. This dialogue can only succeed if all participants start from a view of man which understands man as the living image of God, whose likeness to God consists of the fact that his whose likeness to God consists of the fact that his potentially infinitely perfectible cognitive capabilities. We're always working towards perfection. It's not perfection is the end. We're working towards it. Can always better understand the lawfulness of the order of creation. And with the application of this cognition, can improve the living conditions of all men. And increase the population potential on the earth. We're not talking about an over-explosion of population. We're talking about population potential. Right now on the planet, believe it or not, you wouldn't know this from the Green Movement, but we're on a decline. The potential of population density is actually declining. Now, just briefly, Nicholas of Cusa, and I'm going to skip a bit of this. He, very important, and again, what the quote I said before, that we wouldn't have the European Renaissance if we didn't have the Islamic Renaissance. He ended the tyranny of the ultramontane system, and the ultramontane system in the Catholic Church, and of course, remember, Europe was in the Dark Ages because the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Empire kept this information from everybody. It was only the clergy who understood any of this. And Cusa is the person who tried to make this information known. And one of the ways he did that was by ending this ultramontane system, which was advocating supreme papal authority in matters of faith and discipline. So everybody, because they couldn't read, they just went to church. And you still find this in the Orthodox churches where they don't actually read the Bible. The priest reads the Bible. The priest reads what they want them to hear. That's it. He started the ecumenical dialogue, which is an interfaith dialogue. He promoted this idea of man in the image of God, as I just described, Helga say. But you know, I really have to ask the question. LaRouche would ask: is the mind of man a reflection of God? But that's blasphemous in certain circles. He proceeded to Council of Florence. The Council of Florence really brought an era of peace. Because of the Council of Florence, we had I believe the Treaty of Westphalia, and he was crucial to its success. He ended the Venetian-Norman tyranny. It was the Venetians, who I mentioned earlier, Venetian Empire, who had imposed the Ultramontane system, and they worked hand in hand during that time. So the Venetians were the financial power, and they controlled everybody through their religion. Cusa founded and you can see here, it's so funny, the stamp, he's a cardinal in the Catholic Church, but he invented glasses. So he wasn't just a theologian either. And that's just a European Renaissance painting of the same guy. He wrote I'm going to read this quickly. He wrote a very beautiful Socratic dialogue in this initial ecumenical conferences that they held. And this is very important. In this dialogue, 17 representatives of different religions and different nations go to God and say, "We all fight each other and kill each other, and we all pretend to do it in your name. This cannot be your wish. Can you not help us?" So God says, "I will speak to you now, not as representatives of your religions, but I will speak to you as wise men and philosophers. And as philosophers, you are capable of understanding that there is only one knowable truth and one God." So, because they all profess that, very tongue-in-cheek kind of God. So the representatives say, "Yes, we can see that, but why do we then kill each other?" And God says, "You make the mistake of mistaking the words of the prophet with the word of God." Again they say, "Yes, this we can see, but still this fighting is going on." And God says, "You make another mistake, and that is that you mistake traditions, which are different from one truth." So the wise men say, "Yes, we can see that. But do you now say that we should have a new one religion when all our people were spilling so much blood for their old religions? This does not work." And God says, "No, I am not suggesting a new religion. I am talking about the religion which was before the differentiation, the one before the many. And the one has a higher quality and is of a different magnitude than the many." The wise men agree, and God tells them to go to their respective countries and educate their people in the Spirit. And this was the dialogue that helped set the tone for the interfaith dialogue that happened in the European Renaissance. So I'm on my concluding portion. I know this has been a lot of information. I hope that if you had any questions that you write them down. And I do want to have dialogue about this. We all have a lot to contribute from our respective cultures. So a new renaissance, the BRICS process and the dialogue of civilizations. And this is where trade, not the kind of trade that happened in Palmyra, kind of trade that happened on the old Silk Road, is being recreated by China and Russia. And despite all of the rhetoric and demonization of Russia and China today, this is why. They are the Platonists. And I'm not talking about China as a nation. I'm not talking about Russia or India or Brazil as a nation. I'm talking about the leadership taking on and committing to this process, because change is reflective of the dynamic processes in the universe. Change is a dynamic process, but it has to start from an intention. And the BRICS process that we are seeing today has been years in the making, with no small measure conceived of and further inspired by this movement, the LaRouche movement and the Schiller Institute. Lynn and LaRouche released a report detailing a proposal to all nations on the planet with a financial roadmap towards this development goal in 1997. China and Russia took him up on it. And as you can see, the dialogue of civilizations process has been going on since 2003 with the head of Russian railways. It was this plan, the BRICS plan and the New Silk Road, was initially rejected by China prior to their own economic collapse in 1997, which LaRouche predicted, or sorry, 1998. And after they experienced their own economic collapse, they took a second look. So what is the BRICS? The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It is a commitment to development amongst these sovereign nations. It is the World Land Bridge. It is an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which Canada is contemplating joining. They have 59 countries now, I believe, who are founding members. 59 countries, and others who support them, and Canada and the US both declined joining that bank. They have also a BRICS bank. It is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's the commitment to upholding the UN Constitution. They had a BRICS conference in Ufa last year, and they are committed to upholding international rule of law and the UN Constitution. The problem with the UN is that they don't follow their own rules. And this is what China and Russia are trying to institute. And if you watched President Putin last September at the UN, he said, and I don't think the message has really gotten out. He said, we can no longer stand the state of the world. And he wasn't just talking about Russians. He was talking about people who are paying attention and don't like what's going on. And it's not a matter of like or dislike. We're at the verge of a complete world civilization collapse. Now, I just want to point out a couple of other things. The BRICS University program. This movement, our local chapter, as well as the movement as a whole, has both contributed to that process, and we're planning on contributing more to that process. We're researching right now the possibility of how to get Canada involved in that through our organization. And we, members of our German Schiller Institute movement, have spoken at their BRICS Universities conferences. The head office for the BRICS Universities program is in New Delhi. But all of the, there's Vladivostok University, St. Petersburg University, Peking University, I believe, and a couple of other ones from China, one from Brazil, and I can't remember what the Indian university is called. But this is a program whereby people who are in not just PhD studies, but undergraduate studies as well, they are now learning more languages. So Indians are learning Chinese, and Chinese are learning Hindi, or I think it's mostly Hindi, and Punjab. Russians are learning Chinese, and vice versa, and Spanish. So now, and this is not just a language exchange. This is scientists who are going through the university program in Brazil, for example, are now learning how to conduct scientific experiments in Russian. So now we actually have dialogue going on between scientists in all of these countries. This is this is going to have a profound effect for generations if it succeeds. Now, what else is the BRICS? The BRICS is it is massive physical economic development. We recently intervened at a establishment type presentation. One was by one of the presentations was by a Chinese official economist who was here just for a couple of years. He's from Peking University, and the other people on the panel were this so-called British establishment. Actually, we found out afterwards that they were from the Chatham House, which is part of the shadow government of the British Empire. And the British guy said, this is too big. It's so big that it's not real. No, this can't happen. There's a saying, stop criticizing the guy who's doing it, because China is doing it. Nigeria now has better rail than we do. They just opened up their first high-speed rail route. They have multiple deals with all over Africa.
And Uganda too.
And Uganda, thank you. So this is how the establishment is going after this, right? It's just unbelievable to them, and it really is. But why is China doing it? China's doing it because they know what's at stake. If we're not going forward as a species, we're not going anywhere. We are, in fact, going backwards because the empire, this empirical system, is destroying our culture, it is destroying us, it's destroying our economy. And if we don't feel it here, all you have to do is talk to anyone from the African continent. You can, I just have to make this one point. When the refugees from Syria first started coming out, and us North Americans were a real arrogant lot. These aren't refugees. They have nice clothes. They have cell phones. They were a civilized, industrial economy. Baghdad, until the Iraq War, had a seed repository going back thousands of years. We have destroyed not something that is old and backward. They're not old and backward because they're old and backward. We have made them that way by the policy of the West. Okay, I'm not going to get worked up. In that vein, the BRICS is a system in contrast to empire. It is the future. Because under empire, there is no future. There is no future. We are witnessing either the dying days of that empire or the dying days of ourselves. As Jagdish Kapoor said, destiny or death. The BRICS is the revolution necessary for mankind as a whole to step beyond the oligarchical system that we have been trapped in. And the BRICS is a dialogue of civilizations. Sorry, I'm going to pull it together here. Where the concept of development is inseparable from freedom. So this is a picture of Africa under so-called free trade. Those railroads go from the port to the mine. That is what free trade is. That is what is proposed by China, and that's what they're working on right now. That's the difference. And the BRICS principle, the economic principles that are built into the World Language Report, which is right there, is based on the discoveries of LaRouche. That report, with all of his economic principles and discoveries in there, is the one being used by the Chinese government, and it is being promulgated through this BRICS process. The principles of Alexander Hamilton, which I will not get into. But there's another article here, I'll just wrap it up. There's another article here on Assad's 4C strategy, if you want to understand what really happened in Palmyra, or what's happening to Syria right now. Assad had a plan for getting resources from Kirkuk to the Mediterranean. The Saudis do not like that. The Saudis, by the way, of course, are the repositories of this jerk al-Ghazali and his Wahhabism. And so the Saudis said no. Now, the other thing about the BRICS process that's really important, and what Russia is actually defending in Syria, Syria is the last secular nation in the Middle East. The Saudis want to impose Wahhabism. That's what they want to impose, to destroy that culture, to control that culture. And this is what ISIS represents. This is why they're destroying the history. This was not supposed to be, you know, a resource grab. This was supposed to be for true development. So he wanted to revive Palmyra. He wanted to turn Damascus into a trade hub, and it really was going to unite. Now, right now, Russia also has a plan for a canal that's going to run from, I think it's the Caspian Sea, through Iran. Anyways, it's north of this, and through from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. And that is also, so this is not the only plan, of course. There are many other things going on, especially in the Middle East. But these projects, so again, you know, like the BRICS University program, now you've got scientists who can talk to one another. Now the project is everyone's project. It's not just one country's project, right? It's ownership as well. So the springing up of ISIS was not caused by climate change. As you can see, this is what some people have been spouting off. But the deliberate manipulation and the military interventions of both the British and the US and many other European governments, and this Club of Rome apparatus. The intellectual machinations and manipulations of the Club of Rome and their collective networks today include a collusion amongst Saudi Arabia and Turkey, among others. Russia and China are literally the only ones promoting a policy that could stop this chaos from spreading to the rest of the world. They're the only ones capable of it. And Xi says, turmoil in the Middle East stems from the lack of development, and the ultimate solution will depend on development, which bears on everyone's well-being and dignity. It is a race against time and a struggle between hope and disillusion. Only when young people are able to live a life, fulfilled life with dignity through development can hope prevail in their heart. Only when they will voluntarily reject violence, extremist ideologies, only then will they voluntarily reject violence, extremist ideologies, and terrorism. I was going to go through some of this, but I'll just quickly tell you, our movement has been very successful in getting Yemeni people activated. We've had some very successful, they've actually been reading Lyndon LaRouche's economics textbook in Arabic for the last few years. There's intellectuals and scholars and economists and government officials. They get together and they do a reading. And they, Hussein Askari, who helped me present to get this presentation ready, he just recently finished the Arabic translation of the World Land Bridge Report, and this was a presentation of the Arabic version of the World Land Bridge. Now, this is a video, and it's not going to play. Unfortunately, the link here is kind of weak, but I'll just read it to you. This is a concert that Russia did in Palmyra, and this was an amazing organizing feat. But it was a profound Renaissanceian thing for the Syrian people, for the whole area. And the conductor of the Russian symphony, he had 2 days to prepare. So 2 days before they were set up and on the stage in the amphitheater, the Roman amphitheater in Palmyra, they were discussing it in Russia with his musicians, trying to get them all prepared for this trip. So it was a long trip. They had to bring out multiple generators and get everything set up. Now I think it was only a week before that, they had cleared all of the mines, that hundreds of mines that ISIS had set all over the ancient city of Palmyra. So they got it secure and they got them in there. And now what also is not being publicized at all, if you're watching RT, you might have heard about it, but They also had the Palmyran Symphony Orchestra play the day after. And all you heard on Western media was, this is Russia just trying to stake their claim. This is them in the Middle East and they're going to dominate now. And this ridiculous rhetoric about Russia and Syria. They are trying to revive the humanist spirit and trying to help correct the damage, the great damage that has been done to their humanity. ISIS is a poison on our humanity. That's what it really is. And so the day after, what's interesting to note is that the day after the Russian symphony played, the Palmyran Symphony played, and it's an all-female orchestra. And it was beautiful. And the amphitheater was filled with Syrian people, and I wish I could get it out, but I'll hope that you go home and Google it. But it's really a prayer for Palmyra. Now, I kind of did I'm almost at the end, and I kind of pulled George Lucas. George Lucas was well known for putting the credits at the end of his movies, and this really pissed off a lot of people in Hollywood because this was not the established way of doing things. But George Lucas's idea was that he wanted people to enjoy the movie. He didn't want, because the first scene of Star Wars is usually really, it's really big, and he wants your creative juices flowing. So he decided to put all the credits at the end, and that's kind of what I'm doing too. I just want to point out, if you're wondering who our movement is, I'm sure you get a good feeling about it after this whole presentation. However, like I said, there's lots of bad stuff about us out there. It's crazy how, the differing kind of slanders that we get. But this is really to understand who Lyndon LaRouche is. And it's a really great quote. He is an agitator, but he's agitating for a reason. We come to know a principle as distinct from merely learning to mouth a politically correct verbal formulation of a mere doctrine by reenacting the mental act of discovery. A student is able to relive the thought process of original discovery within the sovereign domain of the individual mind of the discoverer, as much as thousands of years past. And this is the revival of really studying who these people are, who these humanists were, and how their minds work, that we can also share in that experience. But like I said, LaRouche is quite an agitator, and so on the top there is a book by the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. And of course, LaRouche then wrote a book called No Limits to Growth. And he's done this a couple of times. It's very interesting. But just to point out that they are responsible for the Green Movement. They created it. They are Malthusians through and through. And what all of these organizations are colluding together to do, why are they doing this? This is still the existential question. What happens when you destroy the culture and people are no longer communicating and talking and discovering? They do have a genocide policy, and it's not just for Africa. That genocide policy is here as well. It's just they know they can't come out and say it directly. So they have given us the Green Movement instead, along with very many other things. But we really, I hope the one thing that you've gotten out of this presentation today is that the problems that we have, these conflicts, are not just organic. They are perpetuated, and they are planned, and this is how they've done it. Because these elites who have been following history, they do have a collective history, of at least 800 years that they know and are regularly indoctrinated with. And also these historians who wind up being British agents, British intelligence agents, they know how this stuff works. And so the Green Movement was this idea planted to stop development. And we have a big problem in BC because BC is green fascist heaven. And this is not to say that development has to be destructive. And this is the other problem that we have, because we're presented these two different ways, No development is no destruction. Development is destruction. That's not accurate. The difference between a Renaissance in the Islamic world and the Islamic age and a Renaissance today is that we have the potential of amazing scientific discoveries that just need to be unleashed. And those discoveries are being held back by our system. So the Club of Rome is adamantly anti-development, and they started with the Middle East and Africa, and they're going to move to us very quickly. And this is the guy, sorry for the Hitler picture, but this guy, Aurelio Pesci, this is his quote, and this was the gentleman, same gentleman at the Islam in the West. And the common enemy of humanity is man, in searching for a new enemy to unite us. Us. Who's us? That's the elite. He's talking about them. We came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. The real enemy then is humanity itself.
Exactly.
Genocide. So anyways, in conclusion, I just want to say that our BC chapter we're going to be continuing these dialogues, conferences. There are many other examples, not just of the Islamic Renaissance, but of China and Confucianism, which I touched on. The European Renaissance is a huge topic of what actually happened. I just briefly touched on it. We're actively involved in educating the general public of these great achievements and of these humanists, both historic and current. Our movement is currently working with some Syrian refugees who are architects and engineers on rebuilding the city of Aleppo, which is huge. There will be, I'm told there will be no subways in Aleppo because there's too many archaeological down underneath Aleppo. They can't, there's no way. So really it's an archaeological project as well. We're planning to hopefully get a BRICS outreach program. If you can help support us in these endeavors, we thank you. The biggest thing is, if you want to continue to come to these events as well as come to our meetings. We have meetings every other Saturday. Paul Glumas heads those meetings down at, right now we're holding them at the
Lions Club, Rumble.
Lions Club, thank you. The Lions Club on Rumble Avenue, which is actually called the Neighborhood House now. Hopefully you signed up on the sheet and we'll keep you updated on any further events. And we hope to have many. And I just want to thank all of our coordinators and our BC chapter in particular for helping out with this event. And for all of you who took the time to come out and participate and to listen. And I want to thank Salima in particular for inspiring me and for inspiring all of us to help the Syrian people and to get rid of this ISIS scourge that humanity has acquired. Of the establishment, neocon establishment in the United States for what they have done to Syria, to Iraq, etc., and Libya as well. And this is, I have a video actually, but I think this is good enough. What you see in Palmyra is the legacy of all civilization. It doesn't just represent Syria, it represents all of us. It is the legacy of all mankind, and what is happening in Syria will determine the fate of civilization. That's a pretty broad statement, but I'll explain it to you, and I think once you've heard the presentation, you understand better what it is he means. This is Khalil al-Assad. This is an archaeologist that was beheaded by ISIS. Palmyra was his home. There's a town outside of Palmyra as well, where people live in modern day culture, and it's very, very close to the ancient city of Palmyra. He was born there, and he spent his entire life there. He left only to study in the Syrian capital, Damascus, where he received degrees in history and education. According to, he was appointed the director of antiquities for Palmyra in 1963. He was the director of the museum, and he held these positions until he retired in 2003. He passed his positions on to his son, William, so he managed it like a business, a family business. A relative of Assad said that the scholar's deep connections with every artifact and every stone in Palmyra meant he would not abandon his home. Assad refused to leave the city, although he was aware of the danger he was facing. Hariri said they brought him to the square in a black van, then used loudspeakers to call for people to come and watch the execution. This, of course, is the famous Roman amphitheater where they beheaded, I believe it was about 20 individuals. More than 150 people, including women and children, watched as ISIS militants read out their decision to execute Assad. And according to Ted Murray, before a masked militant beheaded the scholar with a sword. His body was left on the ground for more than 6 hours, from 11 a.m. until 5 o'clock. After that, they strung his body up on a pole. And if you understand what it took for him, what was his motivation, what was his passion that he did that. Before the arrival of ISIS, about 70–80% of the most important archaeological fragments were removed from the Museum of Palmyra. Only the large statues that could not be removed were left. Therefore, the ISIS militants mutilated the faces of the statues and smashed their heads. Experts from research laboratories are now coming very much. We have had a couple of cancellations, scheduled conflicts, a couple of people had car trouble, they're on their way, some other people are on their way, so we might have some people trickling in. However, we're going to get started. There's a lot of information to go through, but considering the political situation in the world today, not just ISIS, of course, but figuring out how ISIS came to be. And what is this struggle that's going on? We know there is a struggle. I think intuitively all human beings know that. But how do we figure it out? How do we know what's actually happening? And it's hard for us in North America to put it in its proper perspective. So I just want to test, everyone can hear me? We're okay? All right. I don't want to put this too close. There is music. Just FYI, there is music going on in the back. I don't think we can actually hear it, so it should be okay. We may have a couple interruptions, but nothing too major. So, I'll start with a brief history of the Dialogue of Civilisations. This has been contributed significantly by both Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Lincoln Root. The 40-year history is at the table there if you did want to have a deeper understanding. The World Public Forum is where the Dialogue of Civilisations actually takes place. The gentleman on the left here is Yakunin. He was the head of Russian Railways for several years. I think it was over a decade. And he has been one of the principal promoters of the Silk Road policy and the development of Russia. And the other gentleman is Jagdish, on the top right there. Jagdish Kapoor. I don't know a lot in depth about who he is and what his history is, but I'll just give you a quote. He started off one of the dialogues with the following quote. He said, "The 21st century world inherited a civilization built on blood, tears, and hunger. At its portal stood two gatekeepers, destiny and death." So, as a person from India, he really understands the struggle going on today. And the third person is a Greek businessman, and his name is Nicholas. I don't have his last name here. But these gentlemen have been heading up this Dialogue of Civilizations, which has been contributed to by not only Helga and Lyndon, but also leaders from around the world. Just a couple examples are the Khomeini from Iran, Mubarak from Egypt, and I believe the head of the leader of Armenia as well. So the Dialogue of Civilizations is the answer to the clash of civilizations. The World Public Forum was founded in Rhodes in 2003, and it was an explicit counterpole to Samuel Huntington's notorious thesis about the clash of civilizations. The forum has since then grown rapidly in size and influence in reaction to the insane push by the Bush administration and its backers, which today is continuing by Obama, and if Hillary Clinton gets in, it will be continued by Hillary Clinton, and likely Donald Trump as well. It's a very large and high-level Russian delegation and major Russian sponsorship. The event reflected, albeit unofficially, a foreign policy orientation of Russia's government, as well as the thinking in India and a number of other views. The conception of the forum was approved by President Putin and officially supported by the heads of state of India, Iran, Uzbekistan, Greece, and other nations. So that gives you a bit of a history. So I'm continuing, by doing this event, we are continuing this dialogue. And this dialogue is not available to just leaders, and it is really here to inspire all of us to participate in this dialogue. I think, especially at this time in history, it's required. So I'm going to start off with my thesis. This is my thesis for my presentation. The oligarchical principle. If you've never heard of that, have a look at that word. The oligarchical principle necessitates the destruction of culture to deprive humanity of their potential, to realize our evolutionary potential to higher states of being. These higher states, which today can be realized without war and conquest, but to be realized through cooperation, creativity, and scientific discovery. Altering and destroying history is the modus operandi of the networks that serve empire, not the common good. So today's dialogue is the continuation of many other leaders' efforts around the world to bring the ideas and contributions of their own society's history and of thought. So it's a society's history of thought to bear upon world events today. And this has been going on. This has been an ongoing dialogue, which really can be traced to a gentleman from the Islamic Renaissance named Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina was the Leonardo da Vinci of the Islamic world. And later, when we look closer at who Ibn Sina was and his multitude of contributions to humanity, you will see that within his works, you'll get to understand who he is from his works and his multiple writings, and that he can contribute to the solutions that we need today as well.
I know, but she doesn't understand that. You can't see that through.
So this person is Friedrich Schiller, and he is the inspiration for the Schiller Institute, which we are a part of. Helga Zeppelin-Bruch, and he deserves his own presentation. I won't get into him, but this is a very prescient quote, and I think it's necessary. And I know it has served me well in dialogue with other people that we've been organizing and discussing. And so often the conversation just gets splintered into race and gender and different things that divide us. But he says something really great. And even that we found ourselves together here at this moment, found ourselves together with this degree of national culture, with this language, these manners, these civil benefits, this degree of freedom of conscience, is the result perhaps of all previous events in world history. The entirety of world history, at least, were necessary to explain this single moment. It's this moment as well. And what he was talking about when he said this was, he was speaking at a universal history class. He was a professor at a university in Germany. So this beautiful quote serves to set the tone. And with which I'll be presenting the information to you today. Universal history and culture are two ideas that cannot be unbroken, and must be if we are to have an honest discussion of the challenges and issues of peace today. We are all here, if we so choose, to move forward from the boundary conditions set by the modern interpretations of religion, cultural rights, and practices, as well as false scarcity imposed on us through the monetarist system pervasive in every area of our lives. This is not to diminish or render insignificant each culture or change them to suit one paradigm. However, it is to bring to light what each culture has to offer each other, to change them profoundly from one of exclusion to a culture we can call humanity, a truly humanist movement towards discovering the very essence of what makes us human, the human mind and how it works. This is Senator Richard Black, and he has been a contact of the LaRouche movement for several years. He's been pushing hard in Washington. He's a state senator, so he's not one of the higher ranking officials in the United States, but he has gotten a lot of attention because of his praise of Assad in Syria, as well as his calling out, engaged in collecting these fragments, as well as in their cleansing and identification. He was threatened several times to reveal the location of the items that they actually took out, and that is why they beheaded him. Why would they do that? This is the question. And the dialogue of civilizations, a renaissance is really represented by the Platonic viewpoint. So now I'll get into a bit of the history. So bear with me. There's probably a lot of names you don't know. There's some names you do know. Overall, I mean, it's not to memorize this information. It's just to get a feel for it. So what does Palmyra represent? It's between the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's close to the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it is the crossroads of the caravan trade. Palmyra is in modern Syria, is in the middle of the desolate Tatamarian desert. All around are natural barriers, dry and bare mountains to the north, west, and the southwest, while to the east and the south are dry flatlands, with the volcanic basalt desert of the Haran merging into Jordan, and to the southeast in Iraq, and then Saudi Arabia. To the east, beyond the desert with its wadi and passes, runs the Euphrates River. But rather than being a barrier, it permitted traffic by river to come in through the Persian Gulf from northwest India and beyond. The Tadmorian mountain range meant that roads went either north or south. The southern one came through Palmyra, which then became the hub of a series of roads. Thus, geographically, Palmyra was well served to become an important center of trade if the decision were made to cross this desert rather than take the longer route around it. And that's how Palmyra came to be. In Palmyra, the inscriptions are in Aramaic and Greek. Of course, much later on, Latin also survived, but only from the later years of the history of the city. In the Roman time, there was a standoff between Rome and Parthia. Palmyra, in effect, came to occupy a no man's land crisscrossed with caravan routes. Palmyra profited from its location, for there was a demand from Rome for the luxuries of the East, silks and spices. And Parthia, with its growing interest in Hellenistic culture, wanted the goods of the West. So there was this dynamic going on. They had the Chinese culture, Indian culture coming through there, but they also had the West. And you look, I don't have a bigger picture right now, but if you look, I mean, really the Tigris and the Euphrates is the bridge between the Mediterranean and Europe on one side and India and China on the other. So it actually became a semi-independent town and was the middleman in this trade routes. So to understand Palmyra,